committee meeting. I guess Jeff will take care of the attendance by just seeing who logs on. Just to get some business out of the way, we'll go ahead and approve the minutes. So we have the minutes from September 15th. I don't know if everyone who was there had a chance to look at them. If you have, I'll entertain a motion to approve them.
I will make a motion to approve the minutes from that meeting.
Okay. I wasn't there, so I better not second it.
Kind of weird.
Yeah. Chris, were you there?
Yes, I'll second it if you can hear me.
Yep, can hear you. Yep. So all those in favor, raise your hand. Okay, I think that approves. We do have minutes from... I'm sorry, I'll abstain for that, Jeff, because I wasn't there.
Okay. Yep.
October 15th, we'll approve these minutes as amended, because I told Jeff I noticed that it was dated September 15th. So I'll take a motion to approve the minutes of October 15th as amended with the correct date. Is there a motion for that?
I'll make that motion.
Okay. And I can second it, so I'll second it in that case, because I was there. So all those in favor? Aye. Okay, I believe it all passes. I think that's most of the housekeeping business. We'll see if people are here for public speak at the end of the meeting. But in the meantime, I will hand it over to Emily to guide us forward.
Great,
it's all yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all again.
Welcome.
So we had been talking and using the Miro boards, and I believe that Jeff sent you a copy when he sent out the reminder of what we've done so far. He should also, and I saw it in the email, you should also have received the draft criteria for discussion. That's the first round of starting to take what we talked about the last 2.5 meetings after the introductory one, of taking the different components that we've been discussing and starting to put it into where they would belong in the RFP. So we've got 3 places. The first is the disposition purpose, the second is the objectives and guidelines, and the third is the evaluation criteria. And the disposition purpose is really, that's why you're doing this, right? That's why you're disposing of these buildings in this fashion. It's frequently that first paragraph, and it's where you put things like, we would like affordable housing, or we would like mixed income, or mixed use, or artists live work. You know, these are the things that we definitely need out of this process. The objectives and guidelines, we also talked about those as being the development standards or the development guidelines. This is what you want to see, you know, once you've met that purpose, just using affordable housing for the moment, since we've been talking about that the most. Once you've come in with the affordable housing, these are the details on that. This is what we'd like to see in terms of building and site and types of units and number of units potentially, and so forth and so on. And finally, the evaluation criteria is, and we talked a little bit about this last meeting, that's how we're going to differentiate between the different proposals that we receive. So some of them will do a better job of responding to your requirements than others. So the document that Jeff sent, and I'm going to attempt to share it. I don't usually do this with, okay, in theory, you should now see some criteria. Oh, good. Actually, I forget Google lets me see what I'm showing too, which doesn't always happen. So this is the memorandum. So what I've done is just to break it down. So here's the disposition purpose. You see I've put in from the building uses discussion we had some of those uses that I just mentioned. And then I've got examples from 3 RFPs, one from the town of Adams, which you always see in purple, one from the town of Amherst, which you'll always see in blue. Those are both school disposition. And then the town of Sunderland is a recent RFP, as the town of Amherst was. It's not for a school, but because it was recent, it's sort of bringing in some of the same ideas that we've talked about. And that's the text under each of those blocks is taken directly from their RFPs. So we can start to see the different styles of RFPs. I will say that some RFPs have a lot more text than others. When we go into the objective and guidelines, you'll see again this breakdown of the committee discussion with the breakdown of the topics that we discuss. So building uses, architectural design, sustainable development, etc. And then again, you see the examples from the different towns. And what I want to call out here for our discussion today is how specific or general the towns are. And I haven't taken all of their text because this document would be pages and pages longer than it actually is. But I've just taken sort of one example of each of their objectives and goals. So you can see the town of Adams has defined, various preferences. The town of Amherst was much more detailed. So I've just taken down their preference, their details or their objectives around affordability. The town of Sunderland was also a little bit more detailed. So in their case, I just took out the objectives for building and design and construction so you could see how those looked. And then finally, on the evaluation criteria, I set up what we discussed as a table, and you can see I've got not advantageous, advantageous, and highly advantageous. You can then see that the other three communities broke it down a little bit differently. Town of Adams did it all as a text, with bullets, and Amherst and Sunderland both had tables again. Amherst has it as unacceptable. Town of Sunderland also did unacceptable, but added a not advantageous as well. And the key here with these is that you've defined what you want, which I've got, as a sort of shorthand up here on the top. And then you explain what each of the categories means. So if something's unacceptable, you say what you consider to be unacceptable. If something's advantageous, you break it down a little bit further. So the purpose of today's meeting is twofold. One, to introduce you to the structure that we're going to be having in the RFP, at least relative to these components. There are a lot more pieces that go into the RFP, including, all about Easthampton, all about the schools, the other materials that we're gathering, a little bit more detail about the history of why the city is disposing of these. So all of that is stuff that I'll be working on in January and February. These are the pieces that, are bringing together what we've been discussing. And then the idea is after today's discussion, I'm going to fill these out a little bit more. And Jeff and I, towards the end of the meeting, are going to talk about the next steps of when we bring this back to you. And when we do, it's going to be more filled in than you see it today. But I didn't want to jump so far ahead of our discussions by, filling this out without showing you how some of these pieces pull in. And then if you remember from the Miro board, which I'm now showing here, we'd put a few things on the line. We'd had some different topics come up, especially in our last meeting, that maybe didn't go on our line from less important or more important. But what I've done is tried to pull those that seemed like they had the most conversation into these blocks. There is, by the way, a back and forth that we could have between what should be an evaluation criteria and then what should be up here in the objectives. So I'd say for our discussion today, knowing that you just got this yesterday and you didn't have a chance to go through it, well, I'm assuming you might not have had a chance to go through it with a red pen, just to get your sense of how you see these filling out. Are there things that should be moving up into the actual disposition purpose? Are there things that you'd like to see moving between objectives and guidelines? Are there things that you remember from our conversation that may be missing in this structure? And then, if we get the chance, starting to put some meat onto those boxes of what you see as being either not advantageous, less advantageous, or highly advantageous. So with that, I'm going to stop first to see if you have any questions on the structure, and then we can just delve right in and start, talking about some of the things that we've been talking about in the past and bringing those forward.
I did not get a chance to really look.
Fair, that's fair.
I will tell you right away.
Okay.
I think that the format that Amherst used to put their advantageous, highly advantageous with the bullet points is something we should shoot for. It seems the easiest.
We can hear you, Chris, but it's very, very, very low.
Okay, I like Amherst's.
Okay. I caught that. The rest I couldn't hear.
That works.
So the first one, which is just the disposition of purpose, that's kind of, that's almost like we need to put it to say what we really think mainly these should go for. And as you had said earlier, obviously affordable housing comes up quite a few times. I mean, so like even under building uses, were the top 5 bullet points? I mean, is that something in a paragraph form we're going to, say that basically those top 5 bullets?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be all of those 5 bullets. So, affordable housing was the high. I've pulled up the Miro board so I can see it. Affordable housing was the highest ranking of those. The mixed income was right after that. Artists live work and market rate housing were sort of on top of each other, but artists live work was a little bit more a higher priority. And then the mixed use didn't actually make it onto that particular line, but it has been talked about in terms of the public conversation, certainly as part of the downtown strategic plan. So I actually went back and forth. You'll see in the document that I note that mixed use and artists live work could also be included in the valuation criteria. So for example, we could say in the disposition, we can say, look, we'd like affordable housing, we'd like market rate, we can talk about the balance of those, and then the evaluation criteria can say, but it's more advantageous if we get artists live work, or it's more advantageous if we get mixed use. So that's another way of thinking about how to structure those. When we talk about the affordable housing versus the mixed income, in the disposition purpose, just to make it a little bit more complicated, in the disposition purpose, we can say that we're looking for those two. In the objectives, we can do what Amherst did, for an example, and state specifically how much or what type of affordable housing that we're looking for. The other way of doing that is, rather than putting that in the objectives, that can also be an evaluation criteria. So, or you can have it in both and say, you're going to be considered to be more advantageous if you have this mix of affordable versus market rate, or if you have all affordable, or if you have affordable at certain income levels. So some communities, for example, have been looking for affordability at 60% of area median income. And I've even seen, although not an RFP, but I've heard community discussions in other communities about having 30% AMI. So that's where those different, something like affordable housing can actually be in all 3 of those areas, depending on the emphasis we want to get it and how much flexibility versus prescriptiveness we want to build into the process. Which is a long answer to your question.
So is putting it is putting it in one place or the other give it more emphasis, or not necessarily? Like, for instance, I know, I don't know how much emphasis to give it, but there's been the talk about some public space use. Is that mentioned in the disposition purpose, just so that the developer has an idea we might be looking for that? Or if it's relatively low down, you just throw that? I mean, how much do you include in your disposition versus, how do you know where to put things in disposition versus in the other categories?
So the disposition purpose, you want it to be as close to what you want as possible. So if you're saying that we would like, we'll use public parking because we've talked about that in the past. If you're saying that we must have public parking in this proposal, then it should go into the disposition purpose. We're disposing of this for housing and public parking. If it's nice to have, then I would put it in the objectives and then weight the criteria so that more public parking is more advantageous, and not having any at all is either less advantageous or not advantageous.
I think that's a pretty good explanation, and I think it goes to one of the things we talked about before is the idea of flexibility. So we do, I think to Joe's point, like along this path, we want to pick the things that are absolutely required kind of carefully, and then put the other things into the later sections. I was actually looking at the Town of Adams description that you've had up before, and I think it's a good comparison because they have reference to, like, for example, although the town will provide strong preference to proposals that are compatible with the desire to retain a portion of the building, and they include gymnasium, auditorium, for community use, and they go on to say, and likely the future location of a council on aging, which we probably wouldn't say that, but it will accept and carefully consider other concepts that involve the entire footprint of the building. So, that will be something that, I think with Pepin building particularly, like the gymnasium, we have that component, and so that might be one thing where we can, kind of maybe toy with that, keeping it in the purpose as highly desirable, but they kind of carved out an opportunity in case it wasn't achievable. But
right, exactly. And actually that's one of the reasons I picked the Town of Adams, is because they had that public use component in their disposition purpose. Again, what you would then do is, because that's desirable in the criteria, in the evaluation criteria, you would then weight the ability to keep the gymnasium as a highly advantageous. And it's important to consider, too, when the committee is going to review all of the proposals that come in, because we're hoping for lots of proposals, you can think about how to score the a not advantageous could be 0, an advantageous could be 1, a highly advantageous could be 2, and then the components can add up to a score. And so when you have that score, it can also be a percentage weighting as well. But when you have that score, you have that interview, and then you have the other required components, the site plan, the elevations, the financials, all of those start to come into a single sort of package of how things are weighted. And so that's where the evaluation criteria come in. It's that one component of all of the pieces that come together for the committee's weighting. So just looking far ahead into the process. So one thing that might be useful today, because this is a lot, is just thinking maybe to start think about the disposition purpose. If I asked you for your elevator speech on why these buildings are being disposed of, what do you want to be in there? That's going to then help us figure out what should be in the other two components.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to word it. I mean, for me, because it's come up so many times, I think certainly affordable housing is something that we would put in the objective. I also feel from, kind of the way I think most people in this, or there are some people that will be annoyed if there is not a component of this that either generates some form of tax income or mixed use or something. So I think, affordable housing should be certainly in there, but I think also the ability to mix use or market rate or something that would generate income for the city. Those would be, from my perspective, what I probably would put in the objectives.
Is that objectives or the disposition purpose? Like, that's where I'm a little, like, I agree with what you're saying, Joe, but but it sounds like they're two different things, right?
Oh, yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
that's my disposition purpose, sorry.
The objectives we can use to flesh that out a little
Right,
bit.
right. I had to look it up. Yeah.
That's why I wrote it down and I'm looking at it. So I wanted to make sure we're clear
Right.
on.
Yeah, so that was my disposition.
Okay. Other thoughts? Does that cover it for everybody? And Zoe, just to make sure you can hear us as well. And other thoughts?
Oh yeah,
other
I can
things?
hear. I'm just on my phone. Sorry.
Okay, great.
I would build off what Joe said. It goes back to one of the last meetings, and I think it was Lauren who said it. Like, she reiterated what we talked about, which is we did the planning study before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, this discussion about affordable housing is even more heightened. So I think, like, in thinking that disposition statement, it would be good to say, like, something about how it's a heightened need post-pandemic. I think acknowledging that right in the headline would be helpful. And then, I think we talked about this last time, and I'm sorry because I know I'm going to inject something that's confusing, but one thing that we talked about was that there's Pepin and Center that kind of have some unique characteristics, and then there's Maple Street, which would have some other characteristics. So the disposition statement might be hard to craft generally without acknowledging the two different sites. So, like the Pepin Gym, what we read from Adams kind of makes some sense to be lodged in there, and then Maple Street is the one where discussion of incorporating public parking somehow. I think that came out in the community discussions pretty clear. And then for both of them would be like a pocket park of some sort, like some kind of public space.
So I think that's an important point to bring up, is that the disposition purpose might vary by school, as you've just pointed that out. And so, because of that, the disposition purpose for this RFP might be longer or, just slightly more complex than the others. So maybe it's a 45-minute elevator or 45-second elevator speech rather than a 30-second one.
Do we break it into Center, Pepin, and Maple? I mean, do we have two separate what do they call, Pat? Objective purposes or whatever?
Disposition purpose.
Disposition purpose.
I would argue yes, because Center doesn't have any of those characteristics. Like, it's kind of that box, right? And then Pepin has sort of the gymnasium and auditorium. So even those two kind of beg a little bit of a distinguishing.
I want to hear what Chris has to say first.
Can you guys hear me now better?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we should also, I think affordable housing, that's my biggest thing as well. But we heard so much about the vibrancy of downtown and contributing to that. And we should leave a carve out for some out of the box thinking with what could be done on, say, the first floor if we go mixed use, particularly if we do a tear down or allow a tear down.
Oh, I am glad you brought that up, because actually Jeff and I had an earlier email conversation today getting ready for this meeting. And one of the things that he noted was this difference between what we require if the schools remain and what do we require if one or more of them is demolished and something new comes in. So that I'm really glad you mentioned that, Chris.
So how do we tackle that? Because otherwise we're going to be dealing with two sets of creating RFP criteria if we don't know if we're going to be allowing it or not.
So I'm glad you said that, Chris, because that's exactly what I was going to say. Because I'm still not convinced that it can be one RFP for the three I call it three properties, but I'm still not convinced you're going to get one developer that's going to purchase all three, the whole kit and caboodle, as they would say.
I agree. And I think we should go as granular as possible, although that makes a lot more work for us. But we should go for 3 separate projects. And if one developer looks at 3 and says, we can do what you want, that's great.
Highly advantageous if you can do all,
Yeah, actually.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
And the price can be reflected in that too.
right?
Yes, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was North Adams. It was a very, the document I have, I don't think was the entire RFP, but it was 3 properties at once that were being offered. But you could, if I remember it correctly, but you could choose whether you went for all 3 or 2 or 1.
Yeah.
So, that might be a way of doing it.
Out of curiosity, were they all right next to each other, or were they spread out like this is? Because I think that makes a difference. Like,
I think they were spread out. I haven't read it in in about a month and a half, but I think they were spread out.
Okay.
But yes,
That's
they
good to
do
know.
make a difference.
yeah, it's good to know.
Yeah.
I think if we can find out how to make the structure work, that has certainly come up before, is that, and it goes under that idea of being super flexible. So the idea that they could be bid on individually would be very flexible. I think if there was a way, like you said, Pat, I think to have it highly advantageous that one developer would come in, like I think that, and then hit all the other criteria too, that would be
Right.
kind of a fell swoop, but
Right.
it may not happen that way. We don't really know
Right.
yet. So, yeah.
Let's explore that a little bit. Why would it be highly advantageous to have one developer doing it? I mean, eggs and baskets and all that. We might be able to mitigate risk or problems or get great little niche things with 3 developers. Maybe not. It's just worth talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one would be that let's say only one school gets a good fit, right? Like, and then the other 2 either didn't get bids or were not as advantageous, and then it would just be breaking them off. One might go forward and develop, and then we would have to go back to the drawing board again. Like, I think I'm just saying that's my thought on the worst case scenario, is that one of them, and we could pick on any one of them, like let's say Pepin doesn't get a score on a good proposal, then Maple gets developed and the other 2 get just not selected for anything, and then we are then we're back into the process again, and that's just a lot more effort and time and waiting. The maintenance of the buildings over time will happen. That'll be an issue, like if we continue to hold on to them for another year even. So those are the pitfalls, I think, of not getting them all at once.
I mean, not having one person get them all at once.
I guess it could be split either way. I could say maybe not having one person who can do it all at once, or if we're doing them individually and only one gets selected. Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
We're
I
talking
get what
about, so.
I get what you're saying.
I can see both ways. I think that as long as we don't reject, as long as we leave the door open for multiple developers, then it's a non-issue.
Yeah, I'm already actually starting to think about how the RFP could be structured to, so, what I'm thinking is that there's sections that are general, right? The explanation of the housing need in Easthampton, the explanation of what the city is and the attractions that it has, come join us, and certain of the criteria, certain of the dispositions, those will all be the same. And then I can start to see how to structure the RFP that says, okay, now we're going to take it school by school, tell you about each school, and then, what's there, what we'd like to see, what the criteria are, and then it's your choice. I think what I'm saying is I think the RFP can be structured to make it that flexible. I agree your risk is that a developer is going to cherry pick the best option. This school is the one we want to do, and then the other 2 are less easy to do. On the other hand, you might get 3 different developers interested in 3 different schools that, and each of them bring that unique factor, Chris, that you mentioned.
And my worry about doing just having them all in one basket, that you have that the RFP is you're taking all 3, is that now you get now you get nobody who says, I really want to deal with this one, or I don't want to deal with 3 properties that I'm going to have, I mean, I think you're looking for a golden goose that's going to come in here and buy up all 3 properties. I mean, we're not Manhattan. I don't think, I mean, we're pretty good, but I don't know if you're going to have one developer. I just don't want to be stuck with that, almost that same scenario where now we have nobody coming after because you're not able to kind of break it off, I guess is the word.
It's a really interesting discussion. Because I think you're thinking about the creative reuses, right? Which I think is appropriate and good. We have heard, and it's a bit anecdotal, but we have heard from larger affordable housing developers.
Okay.
Who are saying a little bit of the opposite, which is that they may prefer, even though there's scattered sites, that if you look at each one and you figure out the number of units, the more units that they can provide, the more of the affordable housing tax credit that they're eligible for, and the more likely that their budget will work. So it's kind of thing where we've run into this a lot. The mayor talks about this all the time. Is what we're hearing is that an affordable housing developer won't really be able to access tax credits at 20 units. They're at 30 units, it's dicey, and then at 40 and up is when they get they're eligible for a bigger pot of tax credits. So that's the flip side to that, is that from an affordable housing perspective, we've gotten the indication that it might be good that they could potentially try to get units in all of them, because it might get them up to that 40 count, which gives them more tax credits. So there's a balance that we'll have to strike somewhere along.
Yeah, so that's information I wouldn't just know.
Right. Yeah, that's really good info.
Yeah, that's really good. That is very good information.
Yeah, and just to confirm that, a colleague of mine at another firm had gone to a virtual workshop on affordable housing, and he'd heard that 40 to 60 units was the sweet spot. So just to, back up from Jeff's source, I've had a similar conversation at, from another source in terms of the historic tax credits. That's the beginning sweet spot is in there. So.
And I think go ahead.
No, please go, Joe.
I think, as we said before, I think if we allow at least one of those to tear down, the ability to create more units is probably more likely versus trying to retrofit some of these schools, So that comes into it too.
Yep, that's what I was going to get into a little bit. How do we rectify the differences between what we want out of these buildings between tear downs and keeping? Because they will be greatly different, I think.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because some of the things that we talked about last time, Jeff pulled out roof garden in our conversation earlier. That, a roof garden, which is desirable and fantastic, is unlikely to happen with the current schools. So that's going to be something that happens, if there's a tear down. There were a couple of other things that we talked about. I'm not sure if they're on this list or not, that are far more likely to be in terms of tear down. Some of the sustainable design and energy efficiencies. There's only so much you can do with older buildings. You can do a lot, but you can't do everything. And so some of those desires would only be met at sort of the fullest extent with new buildings. So I think that's part of it, is partly how do you weight what's important to you, and then that will translate into how do we show this in a document, saying, all right, if you keep the building, this is what we want. If you don't keep the building, this is what we want. That's in the objectives. And then in the criteria, that's how we weight that. And I think the most difficult conversation for us to be thinking about is, how do we weight it in such a way that we're giving true flexibility, versus how do we weight it to say, we'd really prefer this option, but if you're going to do the other option, then you have to do these things. And I think we haven't gotten to that part of the conversation yet.
Yeah, that's what I'm concerned about, is that we have a situation where we've got 6 RFPs basically. And I guess I have a question about the RFP market, if that's the thing. these developers, do they have 20 of them at a time that they're looking through, or are they pretty scarce? In other words, if we overcomplicate things right off the get-go, are they just going to be thrown in off to the side for lower hanging fruit?
Emily, what do you think about that? That's a good question, Chris.
It's a good question, actually. I don't think there's a glut of them on the market. I just did one recently that had 2 responses, but I don't know if that's because of the market or if it's because of the timing or if it's because of the project type. It's a greenfield rather than a rehab or a demolition. So, I think there's a number of factors in there. I would say that the developers are likely to be more interested in RFPs that give them clarity about what the community wants, which, doesn't preclude the different options we're talking about, because the second thing they're going to want is the flexibility to respond to the market. And I think that's the balance that we're trying to achieve with putting this together, is not to identify what's important so that they know to respond to that, but not to make it so specific that it's impossible to do, and they've just wasted a lot of time reading and trying to respond to an RFP. That's not going to work.
So since you brought up that you had an RFP too,
Yep.
are you hearing that out there too?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
It comes
I'd
and
love
goes.
to see. What's that, Pat?
It comes and goes. It's not the
Okay.
whole time. So
Yep.
I'd love to see 12 responses. Is that like a pipe dream?
I was talking with somebody from a state agency a couple of weeks ago, and they said, the one good response is better than a lot of mediocre ones. But I don't know. I don't know if we'd get 12 responses. I honestly don't. So the different developers work in different geographic regions. Excuse me, they work in different market types. So again, it just depends on how we put this out and how we structure it. And also how we spread the word that it's available, which is another part of that.
Yeah.
My whole experience has been like, so, I've been in, with the city council, 2 properties were called surplus. One of them, when I first came on council, and I think it was just kind of resolved, someone purchased it at the end of my 14 or 16 years. And so and then the other one was Parsons Street School, which stayed on the city tax rolls for quite a while. I think part of that, in retrospect, I learned was council related, but I'm just so much more gun shy about being too restrictive, and I like Chris's idea that let's be flexible. If you want to do all 3, okay, maybe we can do more for you here. If you want to do 2 of them, then maybe but my biggest feeling is to have this attractive to developers so they'll want it, versus we're sticking to our guns here. This is what we want. So,
Yeah.
I mean, except we're all in agreement that we want affordable housing. So that's a component that's going to have to be there. But,
but it's not going to be 100%. I mean, that's
no. I don't think it should be. I
It's
don't
just
think
realistic.
You don't think it should be 100% affordable? Is that what you were saying, Joe? And is that what you meant?
Correct.
Yeah.
I think my feeling was, because if it is, as you had mentioned last time, it's more likely going to be a not-for-profit, that property is not going to be taxed at all. And I think people would be insanely upset about that. I mean, they'd say, just give to Williston then, if that's what it's going to do. So I think a significant amount, but I think 100% would not go over well in the city.
And I think, and Pat seemed to agree with that, although I would say that I believe that there's a little bit of a balance to that. And I appreciate the Williston notion, which is the thing that Williston doesn't do, though, is Williston doesn't provide the city with affordable housing units that we desperately need. So to balance, I feel like I'm doing this, and I hope you guys appreciate it, but I think we're the balancing tax revenue versus the affordable housing units that we need. And then I think the last time I said it was like balancing affordable housing versus historic preservation. Mm-hmm. So I think when we march this through that public process, I think those are kind of tough questions that would be my counterbalance to the no tax revenue, is that it's not Williston, because they would be providing 100%. So let's say even if it's 45 units, right? If that was the maximum number, that's 45 more affordable, units than we have.
Yeah.
We haven't built many since 2015. So, one quick thing on the this idea of demolition and whether it would yield more units. We are working out parallel path on due diligence, and so maybe there's a chance that we have Valley CDC is around to help us do certain things related to this project, and maybe they could help us crunch some numbers and figure out a little bit about this. And the other thing that occurs to me is we're shifting a gear to potentially partner with Mass Development, who is it's a quasi public agency that helps communities do this kind of thing. And one of the comments that they made was that it's actually quite expensive to demolish a big building. And if they're in good enough shape, it might actually be, it might be more cost effective to renovate. So, like if you're understanding that the structure of the school is in good shape, I think we have a lot of issues with ADA and an elevator, but if they overcome that cost and they think that renovating is actually more cost effective, then that's important too. So that's information that I hope we can start to get before we finalize everything, and that might be informative of how likely it is that someone's going to come in and propose to demolish any of them, because it's going to be pretty expensive too. So
Right.
I just wanted to throw that. We're still lacking some information that might help, kind of things like that.
Yeah, and I saw, Chris, your comment on the idea of first floor retail for, the tax revenue. I think that's more likely to happen if it's a new building. The way the current buildings are set up, it's not an ideal situation for retail. I could see some other ground floor commercial uses, right? I could see, we talked about artist studios, we talked about makerspace, something a little bit unusual, maybe even, if you had those in combination with, a cafe or something, that might be possible. But traditional ground floor retail is not likely to work in these schools. They're a little bit off the beaten path from the rest of the, there's not a cluster right there. And then, as Jeff mentioned, the accessibility, also they don't have storefront windows to draw people in who are passing. So,
No, I definitely had a tear down in mind when I made
okay, yeah, I thought you might, but just wanted to clarify that. So what it kind of feels like to me is, we'll talk about next steps as we approach 6 o'clock a little bit more. But I think one of the things that I can certainly do for our next meeting is start to show you how a structure of setting up these criteria so the two different things, right? One is we're going to allow you to respond to multiple buildings. So how does that look in a document? And two is we're going to allow you to respond to retaining versus demolish. Again, how does that look in a document? And, does this look so complex that we think people are going to run screaming? Or, is this something that somebody could actually see it as a menu of choices and it's legible? So that's something I can certainly work on, showing just how that would feel.
And do we specify, the buildings that can be demolished, the buildings that cannot be demolished? And I mean, that's something. Or do we say, if you demolish one of them, we're not going to tell you which one, you get something, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would be hard. I think it would be hard to specify one or more to stay, because then I think we have to justify it with some basis, and I don't know that we have that. We did do. There was one piece of information that will feed us, so that was my reference to more information coming. We just completed a Main Street historic district inventory, and so it was a long-standing project that was kind of in the wings for a while. But they did inventory, at least from the exterior of the three schools, and it's a good news situation, which is that they're all eligible to, they would be eligible to be become a registered. I'm not using the right terminology.
Landmark?
Yeah, close to a landmark. Emily, maybe you know.
On the National Register of Historic
Yes.
Places.
Right. So, yeah, they don't automatically do. It doesn't automatically happen. So you know what we're being told generally is that a developer, if they wanted to pursue historic tax credits, then we have laid just enough foundation work for them to say, okay, the schools are eligible,
Right.
and then they would pursue the designation, which then would allow them to do historic tax credits. So we haven't made them officially designated, you know, on the register, but they are eligible, which is kind of good. So nothing, I guess nothing would preclude their demolition, but then it also would allow them to be kept and used for historic tax credits too. So that's a long-winded way to say, like, if we just picked one, it might just be kind of arbitrary to which one we would pick to save. So it's kind of going on the flexibility would be just an open, you know, opportunity for them to do an evaluation and pick what needed to be done.
Hey, Jeff, are tax credits beneficial to nonprofits?
Yeah, I think like a nonprofit would, you know, in some cases they would go for affordable housing tax credits, and they might stack historic tax credits on top to, I'm not an expert in this, but nonprofits definitely will rely on the variety of tax credits that there are out there.
They can syndicate them. Don't ask me how it's done. It's been a long time since I read up on it, but they can syndicate the tax credits to for-profit investors.
Okay.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that, so obviously I just think of like historic places that you can't do certain things. So I'm assuming that's why we wouldn't, like today, list them on a historical thing, because if I'm understanding correctly, like if they were all on the register or whatever that thing is, you wouldn't be able to tear any of them down, I would imagine. That's what it comes down to, right?
I think that's like a safe assumption.
And so okay.
But the thing,
I think you can I do actually think you can tear them down, but it's harder. If you're going to go for historic tax credits, you have to follow the requirements from the Secretary of the Interior for historic buildings. There's certain requirements for indoor and interior and exterior work. It is possible to demolish a building on the National Register, but it's not as easy.
Then you don't get those tax.
Well, you definitely don't. Yeah, you definitely don't get the tax credits.
I was just thinking of like, and I don't, and maybe this is a bad example, or maybe I'm not even close, but didn't 15 Cottage Street, wasn't there some historic tax credits along those lines as well? And maybe it was before your time, Jeff, but I'm just trying to remember, were they, or was that more for something else?
I had heard that too. I do believe that they use historic tax credits. I think the reason why we wouldn't start right now to go get them registered on the list, because we don't know if the prospective developers will need it.
Right.
So they all often like they might choose to preserve the building, but not access the historic tax credits, because I think there's a lot of strings that get attached to those historic tax credits, and it's really we want to keep it like available.
I got
mandated that they because I think a lot of people might not choose to do that program, but still keep the building. So it's the flexibility idea, I think, comes.
Yeah, I think keep the flexibility up 100 as much as we can. Like to Joe's point of just let's big wide net. Jeff, I have a quick question though. I think last meeting or the meeting before, you mentioned that we didn't get a grant for survey and environmental work beforehand, but you said that we had a solution, and I'm drawing a blank. I can't remember what that solution was.
Yeah, so we did not get the grant. It was like what we're calling due diligence, and so we are going to partner. It looks like we're going to partner with Mass Development, who's that public agency, and so it will come up because we're going to have to go to City Council. The way it works is that we will allocate money to allow Mass Development to get subcontractors to do this work with us, and then we may or may not need to repay them back, and that's something we're working on now. But what they decided, and we gave them all the information we had from when Maple Street was being evaluated at the beginning of this whole process, and there's floor plans in that packet which they thought would be suitable for us to carve out of that one document and put it here, in the RFP available for developers. And then there's a lot of baseline information about each of the 3 school buildings that they seem to believe is enough for developers to kind of do some evaluations. So what we are going to do is we're going to do some survey of the properties, because we've never had a proper land survey of the buildings or property. And then we're going to evaluate some of the water, sewer, and other infrastructure that feeds that area in the neighborhood, because I think there's a legit question about like Maple Street. The DPW director is saying that some of the underground infrastructure, might need to be upgraded. And so we can do some of that evaluation between now and, let's say, May, to understand what the conditions are, so that we can either tell the developers, or we can begin to line ourselves up for future funding. Like that would go, so we get a developer, and then we would apply for something like Mass Works to upgrade that infrastructure. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And that is something that we're going to be working pretty hard on in January. And I know, Chris, you got to hop off. So kind of in a hard segue, something that Emily and I were talking about was having this committee skip January and reconvene in February, because what I see coming is some holidays, and that's going to slow some stuff down. And then we want to get this mass development contract going. And then the other thing that we're going to try to work out in January is really looking at the disposition timeline for voting. And then I think we would have enough time to come back in February with the way that Emily was just mapping out, like how would this look? And then we would have some of the due diligence kind of underway, and then we would have more timeline information. And I think it would be hard for us to do all that and have another meeting in January. So that was a long-winded way to say we might get January.
Okay.
I'll do January though if something comes up, just to put it out there.
Okay.
And I know I have to leave at 6, but continue if you folks see a reason to. I'll just watch it later.
Okay, yeah, I think we'll stay on just to wrap up. But yeah, this was good. I'm glad you were able to make it. I'm assuming it's 6. Is it? It's my clock.
You've got you've got 4 more minutes.
Okay.
So I think, so just to, in listening to a couple of things, is obviously the structure, which I can work on. Jess said something about the affordable housing versus tax revenue decision, the affordable housing versus historic preservation. I think that's something that we can think hard about between now and February, of how those pieces work. I think a lot of the other things that we were talking about are a little bit secondary to that. I would throw in the public parking. I would throw in the the public amenities of a park or playground, and obviously the gym are kind of the next layer down that we need to think about. Some of the other things really depend on, is this going to be a renovation of the existing buildings, or is this going to be a new building, when we start thinking about sustainable development or air quality standards, which is something that we also talked about, the upgrades for energy efficiency, and I'd thrown in water as well, preservation of existing architectural character versus architectural components. All of those start to depend on what they're doing with the buildings, but those top things, the affordable housing, the tax revenue, the historic preservation, and then the public benefit, really fall into the disposition purpose and start to line out those objectives. So those are things that we ought to be continuing to think about, even beyond the structure.
Jeff, did preservation of the building come up very strongly in any of the public meetings, or any of the buildings, or was that a?
I think it came up for sure, but I think it hadn't hadn't really been tested yet. So like that's the process that we kind of have to engage in this a little bit, is to understand, to make sure that if we do, even if we make it like highly advantageous, for example, that they are renovated, we just want to make sure that we know that it is like cost effective and kind of feasible. So that was always that idea. Some of that due diligence was going to help us make sure if we encouraged it, that it was going to be feasible. So
I'm just always looking for ways to balance, I think that, I think the downtown properties, Center Pepper might be nice to, again, whatever developers want to do, but allow the tear down, and would saving Maple for those people who just feel, I mean, you went to the schools. I don't know if you have any touch, it seems like a lot of people have a lot of sentiment associated with some of these buildings. And so I didn't know, is it just a mix and match? Okay, we're going to lose some of these that are just need to be renovated, but we're preserving this one for the architectural and historic character. And I mean, is it something, a balance, or is it we just need to make it attractive?
So I did a lot of those meetings as well, and I do remember a couple of people that were diehard keepers of the schools, but the vast majority of the people that I remember, this is going off of memory, that wanted to keep the schools also didn't want that to sacrifice other things. So it was an item, but not a deal breaker. They were willing to tear it down if they got other things they wanted.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, Joe, because I think the way that you summarized it, I think is different than other people would summarize it. So from going off my recollection too, because I don't have the plan in front of me, I recall there being a group of people who said demolish Maple Street because we want parking. And so like if you picked those two other schools and preserve Maple, and other people were like, get rid of Maple and save the other one. So I think what we did with the downtown plan was gather as much input as possible. I think we know that the idea of preserving them is pretty important, but it was not a deal breaker. And at that point, we had no actual information available, and we weren't constraining people. We weren't talking about is it cost effective or feasible. We were just asking like, what is the input? And so, I think we should keep talking about this because it's not clear to me, but I think once we get a structure, like let's say it's in the February meeting and we have a structure and we can really see, I think just offering the flexibility seems key. And then if they are like, it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter which building you're talking about, but if you are going to demolish it and construct new, then here are the things that you have to kind of like consider,
right?
Other than picking which ones we keep or not.
Right.
Yeah, I flipped through real quick and I didn't see anything jump out as far as folks really. I didn't see that word of, keeping the buildings, and none of that kind of jumped out from me flipping through the handful of pages that I just went through.
Great. No, that's helpful.
Something else to think about too is, as people become more aware that this process is happening and the RFPs are being developed, they may start to express different preferences for different things. Again, this is something that can start to fall into the evaluation criteria, or into the objectives. So for example, it could be you can demolish the building, but in exchange, and I think we talked about this a little bit at the last meeting, in exchange, we want you to do X, Y, Z. So we're going to give you that additional flexibility, but we want you must have public parking at that point, or, you must provide a playground on site, or you must have, higher energy standards, whatever that is, or you must have some sort of tax revenue associated with the tear down, because now you have the flexibility to put a tax producing use where you might not in the school. So those are the things that we can also start to think about.
So I'm going to ask a different, well, it's kind of the same question, but more of a process question. I mean, we're coming up with all of this, these things. At the end of the day, so fast forward, I don't know, whatever the time frame is, fast forward a year from now, because again, I look at it as the schools are going to be occupied until September anyway. So, I don't know where the next step is, but with what we're doing, at the end of the day, we're not the end all be all, I assume, because I assume city council is going to have to dig into whatever we think is good. I mean, and maybe that's a question for maybe the mayor should come to one of these meetings. I just want to understand what the goal overall for us, and that at the end of the day, the city council isn't just going to go, yeah, that's wonderful that you would like that, but we prefer to do something else. And maybe that's, again, a further question for the mayor, but I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. I guess the way I think I would start to try to answer that is in some ways, this is, you're going to be an advisory. It's going to be kind of advisory. So there'll be a report, a summary of what had happened with the committee and the discussions, some of the key discussions, and then there'll be the RFP document that this group lands on, and then that gets moved to city council, which then goes to a subcommittee, right? And then it'll go to full city council for them to whether they want to make changes or not. And so that's, a lot of this is going to be us kind of coming up with the questions and then the response, and kind of being really comfortable with where we landed on why the RFP was structured the way it was, and attending those meetings. And I think we're going to be answering questions from city councilors and questions from the members of the public as to why it's structured this way. Right. And then my understanding is that the mayor has the final say as to what the content of the RFP is. And I could be wrong, but I'll double check that. But I think the mayor would have the authority to accept changes from city council or not. Okay. And then that'll be the final RFP product that we release. Okay. That's my understanding of it. And Emily, I don't know if you or Joe, if you guys think it's different, whether the city council has the final say or the mayor. I guess that would be the one thing I would want to clarify as we move forward.
My only experience was the first RFP on the property. Again, we came up with all the criteria and nothing happened. And then I think at that time, Mayor Cadger was the mayor and Melissa was the finance advisor. And I think they made alterations to it that I'm not so sure came back to city council. So that is at one time, Pat and I knew the charter pretty well, but that's probably where it's going to say. Yeah, a legal opinion for sure is. Yeah,
we have the city attorney he's involved in us setting up the timeline. So I think by February we'll have that mapped out too, like that process. But it's a good thought process, because let's say at the city council portion, there's a push to say we should make sure that the buildings are preserved. And I think we would have some dialogue as to, here are the reasons why we do not think that we should require them to be preserved. And we would have kind of those talking points, and we would have something in the report that would say, here's why we chose flexibility. And I think, and that's why I keep going like this with my arms, because I think in those public discussions, I think we weigh, one of the things we weigh the most is, okay, we have this chance for affordable housing here, and where do you place historic preservation on that counterbalance? Because if we absolutely mandate that the buildings get preserved, we may not get affordable housing or as much. So we have to kind of weigh those two things, and it goes with all the things, like public parking. And I know there's a big push at council right now for energy efficiency, and there was a resolution passed to acknowledge climate change and the efforts of the city. So the same thing is, if we are if we're going to get someone to reuse the buildings, then we likely have to lower the expectation on some of those things. But if we do allow them to demolish, then we can really push that. So it's going to be kind of we're going to have to re-educate. Like, we're all getting educated now, and then we're going to have to send them the RFP, and then we're going to have to talk them through it. Basically, I think is kind of a real basic way to summarize it.
I'd throw in a couple of other things too, just to think about is with the historic preservation, keeping the buildings, you're keeping the embodied carbon. If you want to look at sustainability that way, the life cycle on that. But on the other hand, if we make the RFP too restrictive, you've got the chance, and Jeff, you mentioned this earlier, that they're continuing to sit on the city's budget. They have to be maintained.
Right.
Even mothballed, there'll still be some costs. So again, it's not just the tax revenue coming in, but the tax expenditure going out. So just a couple of other things to throw that will almost certainly come up in the conversation.
But that's really great for the committee as we get closer to dealing with the city council, to know all the questions and to have the answers down. Like, as you said, that was a really smart way of as you said, it sounds like the climate right now in city council is very much about, energy neutrality. To mention, if our idea is that there should be flexibility to tear down, that in doing so, we are more likely to be able to be aligned with their goals for energy. It's important that we have all those different perspectives, because each councilor's, something is going to resonate with each councilor differently. So we're almost going to have to know who's going to want to hear what. So
yeah,
well, especially if it's in their precinct too. That that may even have more of a reason to.
Or their backyard.
Correct. Literally. Yeah. Literally.
Well, and there's pros and cons for all of these decisions. It's not necessarily that one single criterion is the right criterion, right? It is it is that balance that we're trying to do. It is that flexibility.
The only one thing I am certain of is that we will not please everyone.
Exactly.
That I am very sure.
Yeah. And Emily, this conversation was great because I think we've been really kind of like on the RFP and the structure, and I think we have a lot of work to do still. But once we get that, then Emily, like on our to-do list is like a frequently asked question, like some way, like some kind of document that we can work on after, as soon as we get the structure down and understand how it's going to work, and the things that this committee believes are like the way it should happen. And then we build an FAQ that can go along with it, and I think that's the way we can like kind of anticipate questions and start to formulate the responses. And I think an FAQ would go a long way.
I think that would be great, having gone through that with the school, like the building of the school and the questions of the school every day, the same questions over and over, or even the new questions. Like, there's more than a few times I get the same question, or we get random questions all the time. We still get questions about things that we decided 2.5 years ago, but to have them somewhere it's everyone's looking for the information now. So.
Well, and I think a record of the choices that we present in the RFP and why we made those choices, why we considered those choices, would be really helpful for people. Yeah. So, I think that's a great idea, Jeff, that we build them sort of get the structure right and then start building the FAQs. It may also clarify some of the thinking of this group as well as we move through.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also to be able to discuss that we just didn't go from 0 to here, that all your concerns were addressed, and this is how we got here. Versus you didn't consider what I said. No, we did. We really did.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that'll be certainly an important part of the next kind of phase. So it's good that we're thinking about that. I think it'll be good to be thinking about that when we get some of the structure in there too.
Right.
So I think that's good. So I think, I did get a request from one person about maybe the time, like we're meeting at 5. Mm-hmm. So what I might try to do is send out a doodle poll for February and March. I'd like to maybe set up like those 2 meetings, and I'll try to see if there's any stuff. I know it's what works for some people easier, doesn't work for anybody else. So, but I think, is that okay with you, kind of Joe and Pat, because you're the only 2 people here left, but like, I think we kind of kick it out to February, and I'll send out a doodle poll to start to map those out a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Okay. I know I have, for now I have a couple of trips planned, so we'll see what's going on at that time frame. But my schedule is relatively flexible. I can do during the day, I can do later in the evening if we need to. It'll work out.
Okay. Great. Emily, do you feel like there's anything else that you would help you help you in the next month to?
No, I think this is really helpful. There's a sort of a clarity in thinking about how this RFP needs to be structured, and then we can go back and fill in the details once we get the structure there. But this was a good conversation.
Great.
Joe, anything else on your end? There's no members of the public here, so
I saw that yet. No, so should I just officially take a motion to adjourn, Pat?
My food's not ready yet.
Jeff's pasta is probably done. Yeah.
All right, fine. I guess I will make.
Okay, then I'll second it. Two of us. Actually, I'm sorry. I forgot Zoe's here too. So yes.
Zoe, are you ready to leave, or you want to stick around?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
All right, thanks, everyone. Have a great holiday. If I don't see you.
Okay, take care.
Yes.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thank you.
It is.